History's most powerful empire, controlling a quarter of Earth's surface and dominating global trade for over a century, got brought to its knees not through military defeat or revolution, but through a single phone call in November 1956. That phone call delivered an American ultimatum to Britain: halt your military operation in Egypt immediately, or watch us collapse your currency by selling every British pound we own and vetoing your emergency IMF loan while your economy burns. Britain surrendered within hours, and the greatest empire the world had ever seen fell not to enemy armies, but to its own debt and its own weakness, and the reality that it was no longer the power it believed itself to be. That moment, called the Suez Crisis, was the final nail in British global dominance's coffin. But here's what they don't teach you in school, and what history books conveniently leave out. Britain didn't fall because of that one crisis, but because for decades before that moment, it had been making the exact same mistakes America is making right now. And by 2026, those mistakes may finally catch up with us. So let me show you exactly what happened, because when you see the pattern, you'll never look at America the same way again. Before we continue, though, understanding how reserve currency collapse actually unfolds diverges sharply from economic textbook theory. Real imperial decline requires studying these historical parallels, so hit that subscribe button because it helps the channel, and these warning patterns need exposing. Drop a comment too, because I want knowing if you think America can avoid Britain's fate. The 19th century made Britain the undisputed master of the global economy, where the British pound was not just a currency, but the currency. When countries traded with each other, they used pounds. And when central banks stored their reserves, they stored pounds. And when international contracts were written, they were written in pounds. This gave Britain almost supernatural power, where they could print money to fund their military and could borrow at incredibly low interest rates because everyone trusted the pound, and could run trade deficits year after year because the world needed their currency more than Britain needed to balance its books. Sound familiar? It should. But a problem was brewing beneath the surface, because by the late 1800s, a new economic power was rising across the Atlantic. The United States had surpassed Britain as the world's largest economy, where American factories were outproducing British factories, and American innovation was outpacing British innovation, and American wealth was growing faster than British wealth. Yet the pound remained dominant because of something economists call inertia, where the world was used to using pounds and the financial infrastructure was built around pounds, and changing to a new system would be inconvenient. So even as Britain's economic foundation weakened, its currency remained strong for a while. Then came World War I, where Britain borrowed staggering sums to finance the war, and by the time guns fell silent in 1918, Britain had transformed from the world's largest creditor nation into one of the world's largest debtor nations, owing money to everyone, especially to the United States. But instead of accepting this new reality and adjusting their spending and their ambitions to match their diminished position, Britain made a fatal choice. They tried to pretend nothing had changed. In 1925, Britain made what many historians consider one of the greatest economic blunders of the 20th century by returning to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. They wanted the pound to be worth the same as it had been before the war, even though Britain itself was no longer worth what it had been before the war. It was pure ego and pure denial, and it was devastating. To maintain this artificially high value of the pound, Britain had to keep interest rates painfully high, which strangled economic growth. Unemployment soared, while British exports became too expensive for foreign buyers, and meanwhile British leaders kept spending as if they still ruled the world, maintaining military bases across the globe, and funding an empire they could no longer afford. They borrowed and borrowed and borrowed. Does any of this sound familiar yet? The cracks really started showing in the 1930s, where during the Great Depression, speculators began attacking the pound because they could see the math didn't add up. Britain was spending more than it earned and borrowing more than it could repay, and pretending that reputation alone would keep the whole system afloat. In 1931, Britain was forced off the gold standard entirely, where the pound lost nearly 30% of its value almost overnight. But here's the remarkable thing. Even after this humiliation, the pound remained a major reserve currency because Britain forced its colonies to hold their reserves in pounds. India and Australia and Pakistan and dozens of other territories had no choice but to keep using British currency, and Britain was essentially holding its own colonies hostage to prop up its failing financial system. America, by the way, is doing something eerily similar right now. The petrodollar system, where oil is priced exclusively in dollars, has forced the world to hold American currency whether they want to or not. And the difference is that colonies eventually gain independence, and oil-producing nations eventually get tired of American foreign policy. Then came World War II, where Britain borrowed even more heavily, racking up debts of over £14 billion, an astronomical sum in that era. By 1945, Britain owed more money than its entire economy produced in a year where the empire was essentially bankrupt, surviving only because of American loans and American patience. And still, British leaders refused to accept reality, keeping their military deployed around the world, and keeping pretending to be a superpower, and keeping spending money they didn't have on prestige they could no longer afford. This brings us to 1956, and the moment everything finally collapsed. When Egypt's president nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain saw it as a challenge to their authority and a threat to their access to Middle Eastern oil and an insult to their imperial pride. Together with France and Israel, Britain launched a military invasion to retake the canal. The military operation was actually succeeding where British forces were advancing, and Egyptian resistance was crumbling, but Britain had forgotten something crucial. They were no longer the world's banker because America was, and America was, furious. President Eisenhower saw the invasion as old-fashioned colonialism, exactly the kind of behavior pushing newly independent nations toward the Soviet Union, so he decided to teach Britain a lesson it would never forget. The United States threatened to dump its holdings of British pounds on the open market, which would have caused the pound to collapse, making Britain unable to import the food and oil its people needed to survive. America also blocked Britain's emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund, where Britain's foreign currency reserves were draining at over $100 million per week. They were days away from complete financial catastrophe. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden had no choice and ordered a ceasefire and complete withdrawal from Egypt. In exchange, America allowed Britain to receive its IMF loan, and the empire had been brought to heel by its own creditor. The Suez Crisis lasted just 11 days, but those 11 days revealed what had been true for decades. Britain was not a superpower anymore, but a debtor nation that had been living on borrowed time and borrowed money, and the moment its creditors decided to call in the debt, the whole illusion collapsed. The United States today is following the exact same playbook that destroyed Britain, not similar and not comparable, but exact. Britain's debt to GDP ratio after World War II was over 200%. America's debt to GDP ratio right now is approaching 120% and climbing rapidly, where we added over $2 trillion to our national debt just this year alone. And we're borrowing $7 billion every single day just to keep the government running. Britain lost its reserve currency status partly because it kept spending on a global military presence it could no longer afford. America currently spends more on its military than the next 9 countries combined, where we have over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries, and we're policing the world with a credit card. Britain maintained the illusion of power by forcing colonies to use the pound. America maintains the illusion of power by forcing oil to be sold in dollars, but that system is cracking, where China and Russia now conduct most of their trade in their own currencies, and the BRICS nations are actively building alternative payment systems, and even traditional American allies are starting to hedge their bets. Britain refused to accept its diminished status, and kept acting like the dominant power, even when the numbers told a different story. America still acts as if it's 1995, and as if we produce everything the world needs, and as if there's no alternative to the dollar, and as if our military can solve every problem. That arrogance cost Britain everything, and it's about to cost America the same. But here's the part that really keeps me up at night. Britain's fall happened gradually, then suddenly. For decades, the warning signs were there, including the debt accumulation and the industrial decline and the overextended military, But because the pound remained strong, and because the empire still looked impressive on a map, British leaders convinced themselves that the good times would last forever. Then came one crisis, just one crisis, and in 11 days, a century of dominance was over. America's Suez moment is coming. It could be a failed military intervention that turns the world against us, or it could be a debt ceiling crisis where Congress plays chicken one too many times, and the world decides American Treasury bonds are no longer a safe bet, or it could be a geopolitical humiliation where we try to use financial sanctions and the target simply refuses to comply because they no longer need our banking system. It could be something we can't even predict, some shock that reveals what has been true for years. America is living beyond its means, sustained only by the world's willingness to keep accepting our currency. The numbers for 2026 are particularly alarming, where the Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments on the national debt will exceed $1 trillion annually. We'll be spending more on interest than we spend on defense and more on interest than we spend on Medicare, and we'll be like a household that's so deep in credit card debt that the minimum payments alone consume most of the paycheck. When Britain reached this point, the end came fast, where there was no gradual decline and no gentle transition. One day, Britain was making demands, and the next day, Britain was taking orders. And one day, the pound was a symbol of global power, while the next day, it was a cautionary tale. The British Empire made many mistakes in its final decades, but its final mistake that sealed its fate was the refusal to see what was right in front of its face. British leaders kept telling themselves that reputation would substitute for reality, and that history entitled them to a future, and that the world owed them something because of who they used to be. America is telling itself the same story right now. We believe that because we won the Cold War, and because we built the internet, and because we put men on the moon, the world will keep accepting our currency and our leadership forever. And we believe that being American means the rules of economics don't apply to us. Every fallen empire believed the same thing. The British pound didn't collapse because of enemies, but collapsed because of choices. Choices to spend more than they earned, and choices to borrow instead of build, and choices to maintain pride instead of maintain solvency, and choices to live in the past instead of preparing for the future. America is making those same choices right now every single day, and the clock is ticking. Before Suez and before the humiliation, there was a moment when Britain could have changed course. In the early 1950s, a few economists and Treasury officials saw what was coming, where they wrote internal memos warning that Britain's financial position was unsustainable. And they begged political leaders to cut military spending and to stop pretending and to accept the new reality of a post-imperial world. Those warnings were ignored because politicians didn't want to hear bad news, and the public didn't want to accept decline, and the newspapers called the pessimists traitors and defeatists. Everyone wanted to believe that Britain was still great, and still powerful, and still special. So the spending continued, and the borrowing continued, and the denial continued until November 1956, when reality could no longer be ignored. America is at that exact same moment right now. The warnings are everywhere, where the Congressional Budget Office has been screaming about unsustainable debt for years, and economists across the political spectrum agree that the current trajectory is a mathematical impossibility. Former Treasury secretaries and Federal Reserve chairs and even Wall Street executives are publicly warning that something has to change, and just like in Britain, those warnings are being ignored. Politicians keep promising tax cuts and new spending programs, while the public keeps expecting services without paying for them, and anyone who points out the math gets dismissed as a pessimist or an alarmist. We even have our own version of the British obsession with the gold standard. Britain destroyed its economy trying to maintain an exchange rate that no longer reflected reality, and America is destroying its economy trying to maintain a lifestyle that no longer reflects reality. We consume more than we produce, and we spend more than we earn, and we borrow from the future to pay for the present, and we tell ourselves this can go on forever because we're America. Let me be clear about what happens when a reserve currency falls, because it's not an abstract economic concept, but devastation for ordinary people. When the pound collapsed, British citizens watched their savings lose value, where the cost of imports skyrocketed, and inflation ate away at wages, and jobs disappeared as industries that depended on cheap foreign inputs could no longer compete. The standard of living that British people had taken for granted evaporated within a generation. If the dollar loses its reserve currency status, every American will feel it. Everything we import, which is almost everything we consume, will cost dramatically more, and interest rates on mortgages and car loans and credit cards will spike. The government will have to either slash services or raise taxes or both, and the comfortable American middle-class lifestyle will become a memory. This is not fear-mongering, but history. Exactly what happened to Britain, and exactly what happens when a debtor nation loses the trust of its creditors. The timeline is what concerns me most. Britain's transition from apparent strength to obvious weakness took about 30 years, from 1920 to 1950, but the final collapse when it came took less than 2 weeks. America's transition has been underway since at least the 1970s, when we went off the gold standard. We've been running trade deficits every single year since 1975, and we've been accumulating debt at an accelerating pace since the 2008 financial crisis, and the foundation has been weakening for 50 years, which means the collapse when it comes will be even more sudden than Britain's was. I don't know if that collapse will come in 2026, specifically because nobody can predict the exact moment when confidence breaks. But I do know that every year that passes without fundamental change makes the eventual reckoning worse. Every $1 trillion we add to the debt, and every factory we offshore, and every month we spend more than we earn brings us closer to our own Suez moment. The question is not whether America will face its Suez moment, but whether we'll be prepared when it arrives, whether we'll have built the resilience and the savings and the real productive capacity to weather the storm, or whether we'll be like Britain in November 1956, watching helplessly as decades of denial catch up with us in a matter of days. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, the rhyme between Britain then and America now is almost perfect, with same debt patterns and same military overreach and same arrogance and same blindness and same refusal to see what's right in front of our faces. The British Empire's final mistake was believing it was too big to fail, and America is making that same mistake right now. We're living in the echo of history, following footsteps that lead off a cliff, and most people are too comfortable to notice. The only question left is whether we'll wake up in time or whether 2026 will be our 1956. Thanks for watching. Here's what I want, knowing from you though. Knowing everything you now know about how Britain's reserve currency status collapsed in just 11 days after decades of denial, do you think America can actually change course, or are we too politically divided and too comfortable to make the painful adjustments that would prevent our own Suez moment? That question determines whether this is a warning we heed or a future we're doomed to repeat. So drop your take in the comments, because I genuinely want hearing whether you think we're salvageable or whether the parallels are just too perfect. Subscribe, because the only question left is whether we'll wake up in time.